The observation post. Sentinel Prime hung in the cold void just outside the Oort cloud, a silent multi-billion-ton monument to galactic paranoia. Inside its sterile, oxygen-rich corridors, Overseer Kalen monitored the human project with the clinical detachment of a scientist watching a jar of highly volatile acid. To the rest of the galaxy, the Sector Zero was a nature preserve, a protected zone where a primitive bipedal species was being allowed to evolve without the corrupting influence of faster-than-light, FTL technology. It was a beautiful lie printed in every schoolbook from the Thalaxian sovereignty to the Grawl ascendancy. Biological status report, Kalen commanded, his primary ocular lens zooming in on a satellite feed of a Terran city. The specimens remain in a state of high-intensity competition, Overseer. The station's AI responded. They are currently ingesting capsaicin-laced toxins for recreation and voluntarily leaping from atmospheric craft to simulate terminal velocity. Their adrenaline levels are, as always, at baseline levels that would induce cardiac arrest in 98% of Council species. Kalen shuddered. Humans were the galaxy's ultimate Deathworlders. They evolved on a Class 12 planet where the gravity was a crushing weight, the atmosphere was a corrosive mix of nitrogen and oxygen, and the microorganisms were aggressive enough to dissolve most alien tissues in minutes. For 300 cycles, the Galactic Council had maintained the zoo hypothesis, the official policy that humans must be contained for their own safety. But Kalen knew the classified truth buried in the Level 10 archives. The quarantine wasn't a shield to keep the galaxy out, it was a cage to keep the humans in. The Council had seen what happened when a single human, Elias Thorne, had been unleashed. He had dismantled 12 Shadowborn assassins, the most elite killers in the Varaxian collective, as if they were children playing with toys. The humans weren't protected. They were being suppressed. Their FTL research was being sabotaged, their signals were being jammed, and their history was being curated to keep them from realizing their own potential. Warning! The AI's voice suddenly shifted to a sharp, staccato rhythm. Anomalous signature detected in Sector 4. A Class C scavenger vessel, the Star Reaper, has dropped out of warp inside the containment perimeter. Kalen's heart seized. Intercept them! Signal the quarantine fleet! Negative, the AI replied. The Star Reaper is using a jury-rigged stealth drive. They have bypassed the primary sensor net. They are targeting a civilian transport vessel currently departing from the human moon colony. Kalen watched the screen in mounting horror. The scavenger ship wasn't just raiding. They were looking for exotic livestock. They thought humans were soft, hairless primates that would fetch a high price in the black market pits of the Outer Rim. They had no idea they were about to break the seal on a biological weapon 3 billion years in the making. Overseer, the AI continued, its voice now laced with a new, terrifying data point. The scavenger ship has successfully tractored the human vessel. They are jumping to hyperspace. The containment has been breached. Kalen collapsed into his command chair, his scales turning a deathly shade of gray. He didn't think about the humans being kidnapped. He thought about the scavengers who had just invited a Class 12 predator into their pressurized, fragile home. Notify the High Council, Kalen whispered. Tell them the zoo is empty. And tell them to pray the humans don't find the bridge. The airlock of the human shuttle, the Luna 9, groaned as the docking clamps of the Star Reaper crushed into its hull. Inside the scavenger vessel, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and the greasy lubricant of poorly maintained machinery. Captain Zorgan, a hulking, four-armed brute of the Grawl species, stood at the front of his boarding party. He adjusted his heavy kinetic rifle, his 3 yellow eyes narrowing in anticipation. "Keep the stun prods at maximum," Zorgan growled, his voice a series of wet clicks and rumbles. "These hairless primates are fragile. We don't want to kill the merchandise before we get to the black markets of Krell. High-quality Terran pets are worth a fortune to the bored aristocrats of the sovereignty." Behind him, a dozen scavengers, a motley collection of insectoid warriors and reptilian thugs, chattered in excitement. They had heard the legends of Terra, the forbidden world of the zoo, but they dismissed the warnings as propaganda designed to keep the best resources for the Thalaxian elites. To them, humans were just soft-skinned creatures with no natural armor, no claws, and no venom. The airlock hissed open. Instead of the screaming and panic Zorgan expected, there was only silence. The interior of the Luna 9 was dimly lit by emergency red lights. In the center of the cabin, 6 humans sat in their flight chairs. They weren't cowering. They weren't begging for mercy. They were simply watching. "On your feet, livestock," Zorgan roared, stepping into the cabin and slamming his rifle butt against a bulkhead to create a terrifying metallic echo. A middle-aged human in a faded flight jacket, his hair salted with gray, slowly unbuckled his harness. He stood up with a deliberate, steady grace that made Zorgan's secondary hearts. The man didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a retired teacher or a tired mechanic. His name tag read, Miller. "You're a long way from home, Captain," Miller said. His voice was remarkably level, lacking the high-pitched tremors of a fearful prey animal. Zorgan barked a laugh, his mandibles snapping. "I am exactly where I need to be. You are now the property of the Star Reaper. You will walk onto my ship, or we will drag your corpses there. Choose." Miller looked past Zorgan, scanning the scavenger boarding party. He seemed to be counting them, noting their weapons, their armor gaps, and the way they stood. It wasn't the look of a victim. It was the look of a professional performing a risk assessment. "I should warn you," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave. "The quarantine exists for a reason. Not to keep us in, but to keep the rest of you safe. My friends and I were just heading to a vacation resort. We'd really like to get back to our flight path." One of the insectoid scavengers chittered a taunt and lunged forward, swinging a stun baton toward Miller's head. In a movement so fast it was almost a blur, Miller didn't retreat. He stepped into the strike. He caught the scavenger's wrist with his left hand and used his right palm to strike the creature's elbow joint in the opposite direction. A sickening crack echoed through the shuttle. The scavenger screamed as its chitinous arm folded the wrong way. Miller stripped the stun baton from the falling alien's hand and stepped back into a defensive stance, his face as cold and unreadable as a tombstone. "That," Miller said, his eyes locking onto Zorgan's, "was Stage 1 of the Annoyance Protocol. I'd highly recommend you stop here." Zorgan felt a cold shiver of primal fear crawl up his spine. He looked at the other 5 humans. They were all standing now. They weren't armed with rifles, but they held their bodies with a coiled tension that suggested they were far more dangerous than any weapon. "Kill the one with the stick!" Zorgan screamed, raising his rifle. But before he could pull the trigger, the lights on the Luna 9 died completely. In the absolute darkness, the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of predators who had spent 3 billion years learning how to hunt in the dark. The first scream from a scavenger didn't sound like a battle cry. It sounded like a realization. The magnesium flare hissed to life, casting a harsh, flickering white light that danced across the rusted bulkheads of the Star Reaper. Captain Zorgan gripped his rifle, his 3 eyes darting frantically. The darkness had lasted only seconds, but the scene had changed completely. 2 of his reptilian trackers were on the floor, unconscious but breathing with a ragged, wheezing sound. Miller was standing 5 feet away, his hands back in his pockets, looking disappointed. "What did you do to them?" Zorgan barked, his voice trembling. "We didn't hear any shots." "We didn't need any," Miller replied calmly. He took a slow step forward, and the scavengers instinctively recoiled. "You see, Captain, you spent so much time worrying about our fragile skin that you forgot to check our level 10 biosignature. Terra isn't just a high-gravity world, it's a microbial furnace." One of the insectoid scavengers, a twitchy creature with translucent wings, lunged at Miller with a serrated blade. Miller didn't even flinch, he simply exhaled. A long, deep breath directly into the creature's facial sensory pits. The scavenger froze. Its wings began to vibrate violently, then glazed over with a sickly gray film. It dropped the knife, clutching its throat, its chitinous plates turning a dull, bruised purple. It collapsed, shivering in a state of anaphylactic shock. "To us, that was just a breath," Miller explained, his voice echoing in the cramped corridor. "But to a species evolved in a sterile, vacuum-sealed environment, my lungs are a biological weapon. I have more bacteria in my mouth than there are stars in this sector. You haven't just kidnapped 6 humans, Captain. You've introduced a plague to your ship." Zorgan's tactical display began to scream with crimson alerts. "Biohazard detected. Level 9. Air filtration compromised. Unknown. Microorganisms spreading. Seal the vents!" Zorgan screamed into his comms. "Kill them! Use the gas!" "I wouldn't do that," another human, a young woman who had been quietly sitting in the back, said as she stood up. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead and flicked it toward a nearby scavenger. The alien shrieked as the moisture touched its skin, the salt and enzymes acting like a mild acid on its ultra-sensitive membrane. "We breathe oxygen-rich air at high pressure. If you flood this room with your sedative gas, it'll just react with our exhaled CO2 and turn into a flammable vapor. You'll blow the hull before we even get sleepy." The scavengers were no longer a boarding party. They were a panicked mob. They had been prepared for a fight, but they weren't prepared to be unmade by the very air the humans breathed. They were Deathworlders for a reason. Everything about their biology was designed to survive and dominate in environments that would kill a Thalaxian in seconds. Miller looked at the ceiling, his eyes tracing the power lines. "You have 5 minutes before your life support system identifies us as foreign contaminants and tries to flush the entire deck. If that happens, the pressure drop will trigger our Stage 2 response." "And what is Stage 2? Zorgon hissed, his secondary arms reaching for an emergency override. Miller finally smiled, and for the first time, Zorgon saw the teeth. The white, predatory display of a species that had spent millennia at the top of the food chain. "Stage 2 is when we stop being accidental biohazards," Miller whispered, "and start being intentional ones. We've been holding our breath to be polite. If you make us stop being polite, the zoo guards back at Sentinel Prime are going to have a very hard time explaining why your ship is a floating tomb." Suddenly, the ship's primary computer let out a mournful digital wail. The lights flickered from white to a deep, pulsing ultraviolet. The internal speakers crackled to life with a voice that wasn't Zorgon's AI. "This is Sentinel Prime," the broadcast boomed through the scavenger ship. "To the crew of the Star Reaper, you have violated the Level 10 quarantine of Terra. By council law, your ship is now designated as a bio-incineration target. We are currently locking your navigation systems. Prepare for self-destruction." Zorgon's eyes went wide. He looked at Miller, then at the monitor. "They're going to kill us all just to keep you contained?" "No," Miller said, his voice turning dangerously cold as he reached for the scavenger's rifle. "They're going to try. But you're about to find out why we hate being locked in a cage." The interior of the Star Reaper had transformed from a pirate vessel into a claustrophobic nightmare. The ultraviolet emergency lights gave the corridors a ghostly, bruised hue, and the air was thick with the sound of the ship's scrubbers straining to filter out Terran contaminants. Captain Zorgon stood in the center of the bridge, his forearms trembling as he watched the internal security feed. The humans were gone. They hadn't fled to the escape pods. They had vanished into the maintenance crawl spaces and ventilation shafts, areas of the ship designed for droids, not sentient beings. "Find them!" Zorgon roared, though his voice lacked its usual gravelly confidence. "They are unarmed. They are civilians." "Sir," the tactical officer stammered, his many eyes fixed on a heat signature map. "They aren't acting like civilians. Look at the movement patterns. They aren't running away from our search teams. They're on the screen, a squad of 6 Grawl hunters, armed with high-frequency blades and pulse pistols, moved cautiously through the engineering deck. They were professional mercenaries trained to suppress rebellions on a dozen worlds. But in the shadows of the overhead pipes, a shape moved. It didn't move with the frantic energy of a frightened animal. It moved with a terrifying, silent economy of motion. It was Miller. He was perched on a conduit, watching the hunters pass beneath him. He wasn't using a weapon. He was holding a heavy, jagged piece of scrap metal he'd torn from a bulkhead with his bare hands. A feat of strength that required the high-density muscle fibers only a Deathworlder possessed. "They're persistence hunters," a voice whispered over the comms. It was the ship's medical officer, his voice trembling with clinical dread. "I've been reading the Forbidden Terran files. On their home planet, humans didn't win by being faster or stronger. They won by following their prey until the prey's heart literally gave out from exhaustion. They don't stop. They don't tire. And in the dark, they can track our heat signatures by the smell of our fear hormones." Suddenly, the feed from the engineering deck erupted into chaos. One of the hunters was snatched upward into the ceiling, his scream cut short by a blunt impact. The other 5 opened fire, their pulse bolts lighting up the room in strobe-like flashes, but they were hitting nothing but shadows. The humans weren't fighting a war. They were harvesting. From the vents, a rhythmic thudding began to echo through the entire ship. It was a low, guttural sound. The humans were banging on the pipes. It was a psychological tactic, a drums of war resonance that vibrated through the scavengers' sensitive carapaces. "They're hurting us," the tactical officer realized, his skin turning a sickly, translucent white. "They aren't just attacking. They're driving the search teams toward the reactor core." Zorgon slammed his fist into the command console. "Why the reactor? They'll blow themselves up." "Because..." Miller's voice suddenly cut through the bridge's speakers, bypassing the security encryption as if it were a child's toy. Your reactor uses a G-type magnetic containment field. To us, it's a bit warm. But to your species, the radiation leakage in that room causes immediate neural degradation. You can't stay in there for more than 30 seconds. We can stay in there all day. Miller's face appeared on the main view screen, illuminated by the orange glow of the reactor room. He looked tired, but his eyes were bright with an ancient, predatory focus. Behind him, the other 5 humans were dismantling the primary cooling rods with calm, practiced efficiency. "You broke the quarantine, Zorgan," Miller said, and for the first time, he wasn't smiling. "You brought the zoo to the stars. Now, the cage is open, and we've decided we don't like the way you run this ship." The ship groaned as the artificial gravity fluctuated. The humans weren't just taking over, they were terraforming the Star Reaper into an environment only they could survive. "Sentinel Prime is 3 minutes away from firing its incineration beam," Zorgon hissed. "If you don't surrender, we all die." Miller leaned into the camera, a cold shadow crossing his features. "The overseer on that station is a bureaucrat. He's afraid of what happens if we get out. But he's more afraid of what happens if he misses. And right now, we've just disabled your transponder. As far as the galaxy is concerned, this ship is already a ghost." At that moment, a massive shudder rocked the vessel. It wasn't a weapon strike. It was a docking clamp. Something much than the Star Reaper had just latched onto the hull. "Captain!" the sensor officer screamed. "It's not the Overseer, it's a Varaxian Shadowborn stealth frigate. They aren't here to incinerate us. They're here to board." Inside the command center of Sentinel Prime, the atmosphere was no longer clinical. It was hysterical. Overseer Kalen stared at his primary display, where the icon of a Varaxian stealth frigate, the Nightfall, now clung to the side of the hijacked scavenger ship like a parasitic leech. "I did not authorize this," Kalen shouted, his vocal membranes vibrating with a frantic, buzzing pitch. The incineration order was scheduled for 90 seconds from now. Who cleared a boarding action? "The Varaxian Collective, Overseer." The station AI replied, its voice devoid of the panic infecting its master. "They have invoked the Asset Recovery Protocol. They believe the humans on board the Star Reaper are too valuable to destroy. They intend to capture the specimens and the human who neutralized their previous operatives." Kalen's scales didn't just turn gray. They turned a sickly, translucent white. He knew the Varaxians. They were a species that valued strength above all else, and they had been obsessed with the human problem ever since Elias Thorne had turned their elite assassins into a cautionary tale. To them, Miller wasn't a threat to be eliminated. He was a puzzle to be solved and a weapon to be claimed. "They are fools," Kalen whispered, his eyes fixed on the biohazard readings coming from the ship. "They think they are sending hunters into a forest. They don't realize they are sending them into a pressurized biological furnace." A holographic window flickered open, revealing the face of Grand Inquisitor Vax of the Varaxian Collective. His face was a mask of rigid chitin, his eyes glowing with a cold, predatory ambition. "Overseer," Vax hissed, "stand down your incineration beam. My Shadowborn are already inside the primary airlock. We will secure the Terrans and bring them to the Sovereignty for study." "Inquisitor, you don't understand," Kalen pleaded. "The humans have already compromised the ship's atmosphere. They've breached the reactor shielding. The environment inside the Star Reaper is currently toxic to anyone not born on a Class 12 Deathworld. My Shadowborn wear Mark 7 Enviro suits," Vax replied with a sneer. "They have conquered worlds of liquid methane and rivers of acid. They will not be deterred by a few Terran microbes and a bit of heat." Kalen watched the video feed from the Nightfall's helmet cams. 12 Shadowborn assassins, the galaxy's most feared killers, stepped through the breached airlock of the Star Reaper. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, their active camo cloaks making them shimmer like heat haze. Each carried a molecular edge blade and a neural disruptor. On the other side of the ship, in the dimly lit reactor core, Miller stood calmly as the human woman, Sarah, handed him a scavenged Grawl rebreather. He didn't put it on his face. Instead, he began to dismantle the filter, exposing the raw chemical scrubbers inside. "They're here, Miller," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the orange radiation glow reflecting in her eyes. "The elite team, the Shadowborn." Miller looked at the heavy blast doors, which were already beginning to glow white-hot, as a Varaxian thermal torch began to eat through the lock. He took the modified rebreather and tossed it into the room's main ventilation intake. "Good," Miller said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph of a house on a green hill. A relic of the world they were being protected from. He tucked it back into his pocket and picked up a heavy industrial wrench. The scavengers were just an accident. These guys? These are the ones who built our cage. He looked at the other 4 humans. They weren't soldiers, but they were Terrans. They were the descendants of survivors, of people who had tamed a world that tried to kill them every day. They picked up pipes, scrap metal, and heavy tools. "Sarah, hit the lights," Miller commanded. "Let's see how the galaxy's best handles a fight when they can't trust their own sensors." The reactor core plunged into darkness. A second later, the blast doors shattered inward. The Shadowborn stepped through the smoke, their thermal vision active, their weapons raised. But their screens didn't show the humans. Their screens showed a chaotic, swirling storm of white-hot interference. The humans hadn't just dimmed the lights. They had flooded the room with superheated steam and radioactive particles from the cooling rods, blinding the Varaxians' advanced tech. In the blinding mist, the only sound was a low, melodic whistle, a human tune, haunting and out of place. From the shadows, Miller's voice whispered, "Welcome to Stage 3. The first Shadowborn didn't even have time to fire. A hand reached out of the steam, grabbed his throat with a grip that crushed reinforced alloy, and dragged him into the white void. Inside the steam-choked reactor core of the Star Reaper, the Shadowborn elite team discovered the difference between a tactical simulation and a Deathworlders reality. Captain Zal, the leader of the Varaxian squad, adjusted his neural link as his thermal vision pulsed with erratic white noise. "Form a defensive circle," Zal ordered over the private encrypted channel. "Switch to sonar. If the thermal is blind, we use sound." The 12 Shadowborn, the iron response of the sovereignty, moved with mechanical precision. But as they activated their sonar pulses, the feedback was a cacophony of shrieks. The humans had opened every steam valve and high-pressure coolant line in the room. In the echo-dense chamber, the Varaxian sensors were as blind as their eyes. Then the whistling began again. It was a low, melodic tune, the kind a person might hum while gardening or walking home. In the darkness of the steam, it sounded like a funeral dirge. "Target sighted! 3 o'clock!" one of the assassins hissed, firing his neural disruptor into the mist. The bolt of blue energy illuminated a figure for a fraction of a second. Not Miller, but Sarah. She wasn't holding a gun. She was holding a heavy industrial fire extinguisher. The disruptor bolt hit her squarely in the shoulder. A Varaxian would have been paralyzed instantly, their nervous system fried by the electrical overload. Sarah didn't fall. She didn't even scream. Her body jolted, her muscles locking for a heartbeat as her adrenal glands dumped a massive level 10 dose of chemicals into her bloodstream. To an alien, it was a lethal surge. To a Terran, it was a biological overdrive. She gritted her teeth. The pain transformed into raw, burning fuel, and she swung the heavy metal canister like a club. The heavy extinguisher smashed into the Shadowborn's helmet, shattering the reinforced visor. Sarah didn't stop. She lunged forward, using her weight to tackle the armored assassin into the radioactive cooling pool. "They're ignoring the neural shocks," Zal screamed, panic finally cracking his disciplined voice. "Their biology is absorbing the energy. Fall back to the airlock." But the airlock was gone. From the ceiling, Miller dropped like a stone, landing on the back of the rearmost Shadowborn. He didn't use a blade. He used a heavy industrial wrench to smash the magnetic seals of the assassin's envirosuit. The moment the suit breached, the room's atmosphere, a cocktail of Terran bacteria, salt-heavy sweat, and radioactive steam, flooded into the Varaxian's sterile environment. The assassin began to convulse, his immune system collapsing in seconds, as it tried to fight off millions of alien microbes it had no evolutionary defense against. "You call this an iron response?" Miller's voice came from the mist, calm and terrifyingly close to Zal's ear. "On Terra, we have a saying. Iron is brittle. If you hit it hard enough, it shatters." Zal spun around, swinging his molecular edge blade, but he felt a hand catch his wrist. The strength was impossible. It wasn't the strength of a machine. It was the raw, terrifying power of a species that had evolved to out-wrestle predators twice their size. Miller's grip tightened, the alloy of Zal's gauntlet beginning to groan and deform. "Why aren't you using our weapons?" Zal gasped, his primary eyes bulging in terror. "You could have taken our rifles. Your weapons are too clean," Miller whispered, his face appearing through the steam, inches from Zal's visor. "They're designed to kill. We don't want to kill you yet. We want you to go back to the Nightfall and tell them what you saw." Miller shoved the captain back toward the breach. Zal scrambled away, his team reduced to 4 survivors. all of them bleeding or gasping for air as their suits failed. They fled through the docking tube, back toward the safety of their stealth frigate. As the Shadowborn sealed their airlock and prepared to detach, Grand Inquisitor Vax watched the bridge monitors of the Nightfall in stunned silence. His invincible team had been dismantled in under 3 minutes by unarmed civilians. "Disconnect! Disconnect now!" Vax ordered. "Incinerate the Star Reaper! Leave no trace!" "Sir," the bridge officer said, his voice trembling as he looked at the docking umbilical. "We can't disconnect. The humans didn't just fight the boarding party. They followed them." Vax froze. He looked at the external cameras. The docking tube wasn't empty. Miller and the other 5 humans were standing on the outside of the Star Reaper, clinging to the Nightfall's hull with magnetic boots they'd stripped from the dead scavengers. They weren't trying to escape. They were prying open the Nightfall's emergency maintenance hatch. "They aren't trying to survive," Vax whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "They're launching a counterboarding action." On the hull, Miller looked directly into the Nightfall's external camera and tapped his watch. The interior of the Nightfall was a symphony of architectural arrogance. Seamless obsidian walls, soft blue ambient lighting, and air so filtered it felt artificial. But as the emergency maintenance hatch buckled under the raw, mechanical leverage of a Terran industrial wrench, that serenity vanished. Grand Inquisitor Vax watched his bridge monitors as the 6 humans stepped onto the deck of his flagship. They should have been exhausted. They should have been dying from the radiation of the scavenger ship's core or the neural shocks of the Shadowborn disruptors. Instead, they looked transformed. "Look at their optics," the Nightfall's medical officer whispered, pointing at Sarah on the screen. Sarah's pupils were so dilated they nearly swallowed the irises. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and despite the deep, cauterized wound on her shoulder from the disruptor bolt, she wasn't limping. She was moving with a jerky, hyper-focused intensity. "They have entered a state of adrenaline overdrive," the officer continued, his voice trembling. In human biology, when the fight-or-flight response is triggered by extreme trauma, their brain overrides every safety limiter in their musculoskeletal system. They are currently capable of hysterical strength. They are ignoring pain that would induce a coma in our species. They aren't thinking. They are reacting at the speed of their nervous system. "Seal the internal bulkheads," Vax screamed. "Vent the corridor into space." The heavy blast doors slammed shut, trapping the humans in a long, narrow hallway. The sound of the vacuum pumps began to roar as the air was sucked out, destined to leave the humans as frozen statues in the void. But Miller didn't look for an oxygen mask. He looked at the bulkhead. To a Varaxian, a blast door was an absolute. To a human in adrenaline mode, a blast door was a suggestion. Miller jammed a heavy metal bar, stripped from the Star Reaper's hull, into the door's hydraulic track. Beside him, 2 other humans grabbed the edge of the receding metal. Their muscles bulged, veins standing out like cords of iron against their skin. The sound of groaning metal filled the corridor. Not the door, but the frame itself. They weren't using tools. They were using the raw, ancestral power of a species that had once hunted mammoths with nothing but sharpened sticks and sheer persistence. With a scream of shearing alloy, the door stalled. The vacuum pump failed as the seal was broken. The humans had literally held the ship's mouth open. "They are tearing the ship apart with their bare hands," Vax whispered, his primary eyes widening in a display of pure, unadulterated dread. The humans surged through the gap. They didn't use guns, they used the environment. They used the Shadowborn's own momentum against them. When a Varaxian security team intercepted them, Sarah didn't take cover. She ran at them. A pulse bolt struck her thigh, tearing through the fabric and skin. She didn't even stumble. The adrenaline suppressed the pain signals before they could reach her brain, turning the agony into a white-hot spark of pure aggression. She tackled the lead guard, her impact force equivalent to a high-speed kinetic projectile. The Shadowborn were trained for tactical combat, for geometry, and for precision. They were not trained for a predator that ignored its own physical destruction to reach its prey. Miller led the group toward the bridge, his face a mask of cold Terran iron. Every time a Varaxian tried to speak or negotiate, Miller responded with a level of violence that was clinical in its efficiency. He wasn't angry, he was terminating obstacles. "Inquisitor!" the tactical officer gasped. "They've bypassed the primary security hub. They're 30 meters from the bridge, and they've stopped." Vax blinked. "Stopped? Why?" On the monitor, the 6 humans stood in front of the final reinforced door. The adrenaline mode was clearly taking its toll. Their bodies were shaking from the chemical tax, and Sarah was finally leaning against the wall, her face pale. Miller stepped toward the door's intercom. He didn't smash it. He pressed the button. "Inquisitor Vax!" Miller's voice came through, raspy and strained. "The adrenaline mode lasts about 15 minutes before our hearts start to give out. We have about 4 minutes left. We can spend those 4 minutes tearing this bridge open and making sure nobody leaves alive." Miller paused, looking directly into the security camera. "Or," Miller continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low whisper, "you can open this door and look at the data we found in the scavenger ship's computer. Because it turns out we weren't the only level 10 species your council was keeping in a cage. And your scavenger friends just accidentally let the other one out too." Vax felt the cold touch of a new horror. The other one? A massive guttural roar echoed not from the humans, but from the docking bay behind them. A sound that was ancient, hungry, and definitely not human. The sound that tore through the corridors of the Nightfall was not biological in any sense the Varaxians understood. It was a rhythmic, bone-grinding vibration that bypassed the ears and rattled the internal organs of everyone on the bridge. On the security monitors, the source of the noise emerged from the darkness of the docking umbilical. It was a Kaldorian Ravager, a 6-legged, obsidian-scaled nightmare from the same Level 10 quarantine zone as Terra. In the Galactic Archives, the Ravager was a myth, a creature of such sheer, mindless aggression that it had been categorized as a planetary eraser. It stood 3 meters tall at the shoulder, its head nothing but a mass of sensory pits, and 4 rows of serrated, vibrating teeth. How is that possible?" Inquisitor Vax whispered, his mandibles frozen in a slack-jawed expression of horror. "The scavengers, they had a Ravager on board? They thought it was exotic livestock, just like us," Miller said through the intercom, his voice sounding hollow and exhausted as the adrenaline began to fade. "They didn't realize that on our side of the fence we aren't the only things that survived the Great Pruning. We just happened to be the only ones that learned how to be quiet." On the screen, the Ravager lunged. A squad of Shadowborn assassins, the elite of the elite, opened fire with their pulse rifles. The blue bolt splashed harmlessly against the creature's scales. Evolution on a Deathworld had gifted the Ravager with a hide that could withstand the thermal pressure of volcanic vents. A handheld laser was nothing more than a nuisance. The massacre that followed was silent, save for the crunch of alloy and the frantic, static-filled screams of the Varaxian soldiers. The Shadowborn, who prided themselves on being the galaxy's ultimate predators, were being hunted by something that didn't follow the rules of tactical engagement. But the true psychological toll began when the humans moved. Instead of running from the beast, Miller stepped into its path. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't even take a defensive stance. He stood in the center of the corridor, his head bowed, making a series of low-frequency clicks with his tongue. A sound that mimicked the Ravager's own hunting sonar. Is he trying to communicate with it? The Nightfall's science officer gasped, his optical sensors twitching. The Ravager stopped. Its massive head lowered, the vibrating teeth slowing to a low hum. It towered over Miller, its breath, a cloud of toxic ammonia, shrouding the human in a pale mist. Miller reached out a trembling, blood-streaked hand and placed it firmly on the creature's snout. The beast didn't bite. It leaned into the touch, a low, rumbling purr, vibrating through the deck plates. "You see, Vax," Miller's voice crackled over the speakers, "your council spent 3 centuries studying us from behind a glass wall. You saw us building cities and writing poetry, and you thought we were the civilized ones in the cage. You thought you were protecting the galaxy from us." Miller looked up at the camera, his eyes bloodshot and terrifyingly sharp. "But you never asked why we stayed in the cage. You never asked what we were keeping at bay. We aren't the experiment, Inquisitor. We're the Wardens. We're the only species in the universe that can look a Class 12 apex predator in the eye and make it sit." Vax felt a cold, numbing dread spread through his limbs. The realization was more devastating than any fleet. The humans weren't the Deathworlders the Council should have feared. They were the only thing standing between the civilized galaxy and the real monsters of the Sol system. "The scavengers didn't just break the quarantine," Miller continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They broke the leash. And now that we've seen how you treat inferior species, my friends and I are starting to wonder if the galaxy deserves the protection we've been providing." The Ravager let out another roar, this one directed toward the bridge doors. It was a sound of pure, unbridled hunger. "Open the doors, Vax," Miller commanded. or I let him find his own way in. And trust me, he doesn't use the intercom. The reinforced bridge doors of the Nightfall didn't just open. They retreated with a defeated hiss, as if the ship's own artificial intelligence had realized that resistance was not only futile, but suicidal. Grand Inquisitor Vax stood at the center of the command deck, his forearms frozen, his primary eyes locked on the nightmare stepping through the threshold. Miller walked in first. He looked like a ghost. His flight jacket was shredded, his skin was pale from the adrenaline crash, and his eyes were sunken. But behind him, the Kaldorian Ravager lurked, its obsidian scales scraping against the doorframe, its vibrating teeth creating a low-frequency hum that made the bridge's glass displays vibrate. The creature didn't attack. It stayed exactly 3 inches behind Miller's shoulder, a silent, loyal shadow of death. "Inquisitor," Miller said, his voice raspy but steady. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't have to. "I believe you have something that belongs to us." Vax swallowed hard, his feeding tentacles twitching. You brought a level 10 extinction-class entity onto my bridge. You have murdered my finest Shadowborn. You are proving every fear the Council has about your species." "Fear is a choice, Vax," Sarah said, stepping into the light. She was favoring her injured shoulder, but her gaze was like tempered steel. "We didn't choose to be your monsters. You built the cage. You hired the guards. You even kept a Ravager as a trophy while lecturing the galaxy on civilized behavior." Miller walked toward the main tactical console. The Varaxian officers scrambled away, their scales rattling in terror as the Ravager let out a low, warning growl. Miller tapped the interface, his fingers moving with a familiarity that suggested he had spent his quarantine years learning more than just agriculture. "While we were playing cat and mouse in your vents, we found the scavenger ship's encrypted logs," Miller said, a cold smile touching his lips. "Captain Zorgon wasn't just a random pirate. He was a contractor. His payment was routed through a Varaxian front company, authorized directly by your office." The bridge went deathly still. Vax's eyes darted toward his officers. "You didn't just allow a containment breach," Miller continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You orchestrated it. You wanted a reason to justify a full-scale orbital bombardment of Terra. You needed a human attack to convince the Council that the zoo hypothesis wasn't enough, that we needed to be pruned for the safety of the galaxy." Miller's hand hovered over the broadcast key, the one that would beam the Nightfall's internal data to every ship, station, and colony in the Thalaxian sovereignty. "This isn't just about 6 tourists on a shuttle anymore," Miller said. "This is an audit of your entire civilization. You thought we were the danger because we can fight. But the real reason you're terrified is because we can think." Vax finally drew a hidden pulse pistol, his movements frantic. "I will not let a bipedal accountant destroy the sovereignty. If I kill you, the Ravager will tear this ship apart, and the truth dies with us." Miller didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the gun. He just looked at the Ravager. "You think I'm the one controlling him?" Miller asked, a hint of genuine pity in his voice. "I'm not his master, Vax. I'm his translator. And right now, he's very, very for the man who put him in a box." Suddenly, the Nightfall groaned. A massive external docking clamp slammed into the hull, followed by the sound of high-yield plasma torches cutting through the bridge's outer observation glass. "Inquisitor!" The sensor officer screamed. "We have multiple contacts. It's not the Overseer. It's the Terran First Fleet. They've breached the Oort Cloud. They're ignoring the quarantine." On the view screen, 100 human warships, ships that officially didn't exist, dropped their cloaks. At the head of the fleet was a massive carrier, the USS Vengeance. Miller looked at Vax as the glass began to crack. "Stage 4 is here, Inquisitor. And they aren't as patient as I am." The bridge of the Nightfall was no longer a command center. It was a courtroom where the verdict had already been rendered. As the observation glass shattered under the precision heat of Terran plasma torches, the Shadowborn assassins, those who hadn't already fled or been neutralized, dropped their weapons. They weren't surrendering to the humans on the bridge. They were surrendering to the sheer, overwhelming presence of the Terran First Fleet visible through the cracks in the hull. Admiral Marcus Webb's face replaced the tactical maps on every screen in the Thalaxian sovereignty. He wasn't broadcasting from a hidden bunker or a diplomatic suite. He was standing on the bridge of the USS Vengeance, his uniform crisp, his expression one of tired finality. "To the Galactic Council and the citizens of the sovereignty," Webb's voice boomed. transmitted through the very jamming frequencies the Council had used to keep Terra silent for centuries. For 300 years, you have called our home a zoo. You told yourselves you were protecting us from the stars, while you were actually protecting your own comfort from the reality of what we are. Today, the cage is gone. Webb paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the data packets being uploaded from the Nightfall. We have the evidence of Inquisitor Vax's conspiracy. We have the proof of your illegal biological weapons programs involving the Ravagers. And more importantly, we have the keys to your entire defense network. On the Nightfall, Inquisitor Vax collapsed into his command chair, his feeding tentacles limp. He watched as Miller, the civilian who had dismantled his elite team, walked over to the Ravager and whispered a single word in a low, guttural tone. The beast huffed, its vibrating teeth slowing to a rhythmic purr, and it sat down like a loyal hound amidst the wreckage of the bridge. "We aren't here to conquer you," Miller said, looking at Vax with a mixture of pity and cold calculation. "Conquest is a Stage 2 problem. We've moved past that. We're here to establish the new terms of the quarantine." The zoo hypothesis was officially dead. In its place, the Council was forced to sign the Terran Sovereignty Accord. Humanity didn't ask for a seat at the table. They moved the table to the back row, exactly where they wanted it. They became the Silent Wardens. The Sol system remained a restricted zone, but not because humans were trapped. It became the headquarters for the new Galactic Security Force, a military staffed by humans and the Level 10 species they had spent 3 billion years learning to coexist with. Overseer Kalen, watching from the now redundant Sentinel Prime Station, saw the first human trade ships depart for the Outer Rim. They weren't carrying soldiers or bombs. They were carrying engineers, doctors, and the same agricultural consultants who had once been dismissed as harmless. "They're leaving," Kalen's AI whispered. "The humans are entering the sovereignty." "No," Kalen replied, his scales finally returning to a calm, observant blue as he watched the USS Vengeance lead the fleet into the heart of the galaxy. "They aren't leaving. They're just expanding the walls of the cage. The galaxy is the zoo now, and we're the ones being watched." In the years that followed, the name Miller became a legend, a ghost story told to young Thalaxian nobles who thought they could exploit lesser species. They told tales of the man who could calm a Ravager with a whistle and dismantle a Shadowborn with a wrench. But the real lesson was simpler. Terra was a world where survival was a daily war, and its children had grown up to be the most efficient peacekeepers the universe had ever seen. They were patient, they were kind, and they were always watching. Because as every predator on Terra eventually learned, the most dangerous thing in the woods isn't the one that's growling. It's the one that's waiting for you to make a mistake.